Okay, our last speaker before questions, and then there'll be some closing remarks and maybe even more questions, and then we're off to, as Starlee mentioned, happy hour, which is certainly nice, and the Reagan dinner tonight. I hope a lot of you here are going to that. But Fred Roeder is Managing Director of the Consumer Choice Center. That's a nonprofit organization that represents consumers in over 100 countries across the globe. Fred has been working in the field of grassroots activism for over 8 years. He's a health economist from Germany and has worked in healthcare reform and market access in North America, Europe, and several former Soviet republics. So he knows control and command systems for sure. One of his passions is to analyze how disruptive industries and technologies allows consumers more choice at a lower cost. And since 2012, he serves as an associate researcher with the Montreal Economic Institute. Please welcome for his presentation, Fred Roeder.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Many interesting things have already been said, but I would just like to give some perspective on what it actually means to deal with a behemoth regulator such as the FDA or its counterparts in other parts of the world, because I'm also pretty sure that even though Japan might be a bit smart on certain things, there are probably also patients which are deprived of easier or faster access to medicine thanks to bureaucrats. And I think maybe I will also talk a bit more about the reason why smaller companies and smaller teams of innovators have a massive problem to actually have a market-ready product, for instance, a drug for patients. So since the pharmaceutical industry, and I've been working almost the last decade with and for pharmaceutical companies as a consultant mainly. It's a very specific industry, and I just want to explain a bit how the industry is structured and where the industry actually makes money. So there is this term big pharma. Pharma itself doesn't like to hear it. It's a bit like big tobacco. Tobacco would also never call themselves big tobacco. Both of them also don't really like each other, but they have some similarities. So they're basically in the top 10 pharmaceutical companies in the world. 5 are from the US and 5 are from Europe, mainly Switzerland, France, the UK, and a bit of Germany. And in the top 20 pharmaceutical companies, among the top 20 pharmaceutical companies, you have 10 American companies and 10 European companies. So it's basically a US-European industry, no Canadians, no Russians, no Chinese, also no Japanese, or at least not in the top 20 players. And top 20 is quite a lot. That's just the top 20 have roughly an annual turnover of somewhere around $700 billion. That's probably so it's a lot of money. That's close, I think, to your annual deficit, right? That's around $1 trillion. Whereas it's a lot of money, just to put it in comparison. And then there are much more pharma companies. But the interesting thing is that about 50% or 41% of the global revenue or sales made by pharma are made in this country, in the US. So 5% of the global population costs actually 41% of the revenues. So it's by far the most important market is the US market. Even more important, not just looking at revenue, but actually profits, and that's at the end of the day when a business counts. More than 50% of global profits are made in the US. So every cent change of a price of a drug in the US has massive implications for a pharma company, no matter if that's the American company Johnson & Johnson or it's the Swiss company Roche. The US market is by far the most important market. And that's probably why also lots of these companies don't really want to start a fight with that body which gives you either approval or doesn't approve your drug in this market, because that's 50% of your global business. And this is crucial for survival to be good in this business. If a CEO of a pharmaceutical company, you start a war with the FDA and you lose it, probably your board will let you go very quickly. Because shareholders don't really like that. But now it's very interesting to see that Japan apparently is a bit smarter when it comes to actually letting patients choose and giving quicker access to innovative and life-saving medicine. You would think, okay, Japan, that's really far away, and it's an obscure market, and they have weird TV shows in Japan, so who cares? You cannot compare Japan to the US. Well, actually, when it comes to the global pharma market, you can, because the second largest pharmaceutical market in the world is Japan. About 10 to 12% of global sales are made in Japan, and about 20% of global profits are made in Japan. So Japan, with a population of 125, 130 million, actually brings in more profits in absolute terms than 500 million of Europeans. So Japan is the second largest market in the world, and even combined, the European Union with 500 million population does not bring in as much profits to the profit and loss statements of pharma companies than Japan. So Japan is a very significant market, and apparently this very significant second largest pharmaceutical market in the world was able to apply a certain amount of innovation in the approval system, which is good news. And even though there is currently not a single Japanese player in the global top 20 pharmaceutical companies, thanks to this very innovative regulatory regime in Japan when it comes to drug approval and giving patients access to drugs, more and more investments, and this is what Dr. Madden already said, more and more investments are being made into Japanese companies. European and American companies start acquiring smaller Japanese biotech companies. They start having more trials over there. And also the Japanese companies themselves, they start growing. So you should not be surprised if in 10 years in the global top 10 of pharma companies, there might be 3 or 4 Japanese companies. This happens pretty quickly, because if you look at the portfolio of pharma companies, usually they have 3, 4, or 5 blockbusters. These are the drugs they actually make money with. And if they expire, their revenues go heavily down. You can go on the Wikipedia page, actually, of the top pharma companies. I think it's the top 20 chart. And you see every year there are massive ups and downs. It's a bit like in the NBA league chart. This is not always the same company being the global champion, because the patent protections also expire, and then you need to come up with a new product. And so far, this mainly happens by acquiring smaller biotech companies, which actually have very promising research. But these companies can actually not afford to cope with bureaucracies such as the FDA. So probably, regulators often talk about antitrust laws, and we're not allowed to get companies so large, and that's bad for consumers. Well, actually, the best antitrust policy probably is to reduce the market entry barriers. And the massive market entry barrier in actually getting a drug market-ready approval is coping with regulators such as the FDA. Because that's really expensive, and big pharma companies, like the really big ones, like the Johnson & Johnsons and the Amgens of the world, which are great companies, and they have products on the market that are life-saving. Millions of people are saved every year, maybe even billions, thanks to pharmaceutical companies. They do a great thing. But these really large companies, they actually don't innovate so much, but they have this massive bureaucracy administration that can actually deal with the government bureaucracy on the other side. Whereas a small biotech company with 200 researchers and maybe one lawyer on team, they could never do that, so they need to team up with the big ones just to comply with what's needed to bring a drug to the market. And that really is probably one of the main drivers of cost for drugs, and it kills lots of innovation in the early stage, because some of these biotech companies don't get acquired by the big ones, and they basically just they get bankrupt, and maybe the research is not being picked up for the next decade. Which means for the next decade, more people die from a disease we could have maybe potentially cured. So I think there are also no sound numbers on how much research just vanishes because of compliance cost. It's hard to measure, but one can assume that it is a pretty high number. So basically, one fairly easy fix for some of these problems is to expose regulators such as the FDA to competition. It's probably really hard to reform a massive regulator with, you said 16,000 bureaucrats? Yeah, with 16,000 bureaucrats, to reform that from inside, because there's so much resistance and inertia, and you could have the most dedicated politicians to change something, but the moment, I'm not sure if you watched Yes Minister, this show from the 80s from the UK, so you can have the most motivated politician, the moment the politician hits bureaucrats or faces bureaucrats, things get complicated, because bureaucrats are pretty good at maintaining the status quo. But one way to change things is actually by saying, well, okay, we have the FDA, but there are also some other large drug administrations out there. For instance, the European Medicines Agency and the Japanese regulator. I don't know their name, but the Japanese Medicines Agency. And why don't we allow American patients to actually also say, well, if something is safe in Japan, maybe it's also safe for me. It's a developed country. The same for Europe. If a drug is being prescribed and allowed and approved in Germany, and it's not that you don't read in the news that tens of thousands of Germans dying because of that. Why shouldn't it be tried by US patients? And then suddenly the FDA sees, oh, actually companies don't really ask for approval through the FDA anymore. And that's like, I mean, these approval processes are expensive and the FDA charges fees for this, I believe. Or? That's yes, there's huge fees. So it's not all paid by taxpayers' money. I mean, there's taxpayers' money going into it, but these approval bodies also charge the companies for the approval processes. And the moment they have less companies actually asking for approval, the revenues of this agency goes down, and then these bureaucrats suddenly get worried and need to actually compete with a better way of coping or walking through these approval services. I use an example, for instance, ride sharing. I mean, taxis. I remember actually the first couple of times I came to Washington, D.C., 2008, 2009, you really did not want to sit in a taxi. I mean, they were really old cars and terrible drivers, and they didn't want to drive you across the river, and it was like very, very complicated. And then Uber and Lyft entered the market, and they have very, very good solutions, but the taxis themselves also had to improve and accept credit cards and actually have a bit newer cars, because otherwise no one would ever use one of these taxis. I mean, I haven't used a taxi for a long time, but people use them again, and you see, especially in large US cities, how the quality even of licensed taxis has improved because of the external competitive pressure coming in from Uber and Lyft. And you could see the same if you, for instance, have certain reciprocity agreements by also respecting drug approvals from Europe or Japan in the US. The FDA would have to change its strategy and actually become much more lean and less bureaucratic. I don't want to say unbureaucratic because it's a bureaucracy. So probably competition and reducing market entry barriers are 2 points how innovation and faster access to innovations can be realized. Thank you.